and welcome to the LexisNexis podcast, Speaking of Compliance with. I'm your host, Michael Nelson, Senior Product Specialist for the LexisNexis Regulatory Compliance Solution. And today I'm joined again by David Turner, Managing Director of RiskNZ. David, I'll turn it over to you to share a quick intro about yourself.
Look, thanks, Michael, and thanks, LexisNexis. Great to be here and be working with you again. Yes, Managing Director of Risk New Zealand. Everything today is really me. It's not so much on behalf of Risk New Zealand. And it's from my experiences with working with boards, knowing a lot of board members, being on a couple myself, consulting with boards and also the results of what boards have done. And working with a great number of organisations over my time in my career, which has given me a really good insight. And really, I look at everything from a risk lens and a risk perspective. That served me well, but I'm always learning, and especially from the mistakes I've made and others as well. So thank you very much, Michael, for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us. And today, one of the things that we're going to be looking at, and I think it's an area that people are generally alive to when it comes to what a board is. But I think today we're going to be looking a little bit more at not just what makes for a generic kind of board, but what areas that boards can look to become a more effective unit for the companies that they represent and drive. So I guess just to put the whole concept into context, when we're looking at boards, obviously, through the lens of the Companies Act 1993, what would you describe a director's duties to be generally?
Oh, look, generally, when we looked at the Act and, the New Zealand Act, and I've been familiar with Australia as well, it really comes down to the generic ones, determining, implementing policies. They make different decisions. They maintain, keeping records. They look after contracts. They kind of set the direction, and they really oversee the organisation. But in a nutshell, I think there's a lot of extra bits that go in there. There's a great deal in those two acts that really have to be adhered to, and it's a really good reference. But I also think it's evolving where directors really, the expectations are so much more. And as the environment and the global kind of different areas evolve, so do, or should do, directors in those boards.
Yeah, no, and I think it's a really good point, because quite often what you'll find, and certainly in my limited experience, is that people come to a board position with an expectation of what that role entails. But as you said, the landscape is shifting, and quite often what people imagine the role of a board member to be may not necessarily be entirely in sync with what that role is currently and what the expectations and what the duties are associated with that particular role. So there's occasionally a tension between what someone thinks they should be doing and what their broader responsibilities might look like. Now, I think one of the points that we've previously touched on in conversations prior to this podcast is the role of governance, and governance, I think, is one of those terms that's generally understood, but occasionally, because there's this sort of general sense, occasionally misunderstood. And so when we're talking about governance as a sort of a general concept for a board, how would you pin that down to give people who are listening to this, who may be board members or who may be looking to join a board, how would you pin that down to sort of crystallize an understanding for the benefit of our audience about what proper governance looks like?
Oh, great question. And look, as I said, I'm always learning, but I'm always learning a lot from directors and boards as well. And if I look at one key area of the Companies Act and directors' duties, and that's around, I think, taking the care, diligence and skill that's reasonable to a director, I think that covers a lot of different areas, and there's a lot of different thinking. And I think it's probably one of the hot key items for today. So I'd really go from that into making sure that governance is in touch with the organisation and boards really understand not every moving part in the organisation, they probably can't, but especially the key ones that will affect that organisation, and the key ones that really need attention to make more effective governance. So I think it's an understanding of the organisation, and I see that, over many, which is great, but I still see some room for improvement.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the point you make is it's not really a simple, straightforward reading of the obligations that arise under either whether it's the Companies Act in New Zealand or the Corps Act over here, but getting to grips with what the organisation is, what its culture is, and being more engaged in not the day-to-day running. Obviously, that's what your management team is for, but more engaged in what the organisation is trying to achieve, and being a part of that development process and that growth process to assist the organisation to achieve the goals that it sets out in its strategic plan in a way that's consistent with the organisational culture and the director's duties under the various regulatory regimes. Would that be fair?
I completely agree. It is a wide area. I would really be following what you just said there, and exactly there's so much more that we need to learn as we go forward.
Yeah. That then moves on to questions about some of the areas where you've seen boards not necessarily achieve their highest capacity. And I guess it gets back to that point we were talking about before about the tension between what a board member might expect their responsibilities to be and what they actually might be. So when you're talking to board members, what are the areas where you've seen board members perhaps aren't as alive to what those obligations and what their proper function might look like? Are there some particular key areas that you've seen, or is it, does it vary according to the organisation and the board member?
I think it really varies to the organisation, the board member, and that's really around how the board member is chosen, what went into that, what skill sets the board or the organisation is after, and if they really understand or are aligned to where they're going, that will really determine who maybe comes on board, even though it might be a more collective decision and a more collective vote. But one thing I do see getting on boards is probably not quite enough, and I'm not just saying it because I'm in it, risk management experience, I think, across the many different aspects that we have in risk. So that then goes into understanding the organisation's culture, the goals of the senior management team, all that kind of thing before you start choosing board members, really knowing your own board really, really well. And then I think the selection gets much tighter.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point about addressing the notion of risk, because I guess there are really two limbs when it comes to risk, aren't there? There's one that the organisation needs to take into account, but also there are elements of risk that necessarily associated with someone coming onto a board. And I guess when you're working with board members, is that distinction very clear? And do board members thoroughly understand, in your experience, not just the risks an organisation might face, but also the risks that they might face personally when they're taking on that position?
I think it is. There's a lot more accountability and then expectations that really go together on boards. And when we're talking about accountability, there was a time not so long ago where people were quite hesitant to get on boards because they were really being taken to task in some areas, or they really needed to know their stuff with the organisation. Look, I'm not saying they don't know their stuff, but it's changing where board members are really getting on, and they have to not just sit on the board, but they have to contribute to the discussion, contribute to the momentum of the organisation, and especially contribute to that leadership as a whole. We're getting away very quickly from, not that some do, but some might, following or kind of that negative group think where there's one person or three people in the room making a decision and the rest go with that. Because there's a lot more accountability and there's a lot more, say, competitive in the marketplace. Look what we've been through in the past 2 or 3 years. We really have to be on point and really have to be quite nimble. And I think because of that, board members really have to come on with that focus. I think it's gone a long way now from sitting on there having a gin and tonic and going to the golf course.
Yeah, which in some days, simpler times, simpler ideas. But I think you're right. Certainly, there is a need for boards to be active in their space, but also understand what their space is and where their responsibilities start, and potentially where they need to work with their senior management team to make sure that everything is rolling as smoothly as it possibly can. So given that you deal with a lot of boards, and given we've got now, I think, a better sense of some of the challenges that boards face intrinsically, how do we go about exploring the idea of better boards? So I know from my own, again, fairly limited experience, one of the things that we try and do in the organizations that I'm involved with is ensure that there is a diversity of voice. And I wonder, in your experience, how a board might go about beginning to look at the areas where it's currently really strong, but also begin to look at the areas where there are aspects that there might be some redundancy, if you like. You might have a variety of different people from the same sort of sector or from the same sort of background or the same sort of experience set, which then inherently leaves the organization facing a structural weakness in their board.
Yeah, sure. Look, we probably put this, how do we make a better board? So we look at, I would say, from what I've seen, the way people think from their experiences. So we're after a diverse, I think it's the key thing here. We need more diversity on our boards, whether it's culture, whether it's gender, whether it's experiences, whether it's people from other organisations coming in with different views on your market that you're in, and especially views on your market and broader markets. We need a mix on that board, but one that also makes sense and one that aligns. And so I think a lot more thinking has to go into getting the organisation of who do we want, why do we want these people, and what is their objective going forward. So it's that diversity and experience. It's complementing experience from other industries. It's the multicultural approach, and that's really big now. It's making sure that we can connect with many different cultures, especially the ones we might be playing with at the time or working with at the time. And we show respect, I think, for that. And that needs to go a long way, I think, in improvement on some areas. We need to understand, or board members need to understand a strategy and align to that and what that means. They need to have that split on cultural diversity and skill diversity as well, where the skills are coming in and they do complement, as I said before, each other, and they are aligned to the organisation. So what I'm kind of saying here, if you like, in short, is that we really need to rethink who we're getting on the board and why. And if we do that, especially again from a risk perspective, I think this would be very beneficial for going forward, and it might even raise performance, it might even raise efficiencies, and it would certainly, I think, raise a lot of awareness and gratitude from shareholders and the general population.
Yeah, no, agreed. I mean, one of the traditional tools that I've seen used is a skills matrix when you're looking to examine where you're at with the board, and quite often it falls within things like, well, do they have legal experience, or do they have accounting experience, or do they have marketing experience or HR experience? And you build up a skills matrix to make sure that each of those areas that generally fall into the kind of categories of subcommittee that an organization might have, you want those populated with people who know what they're talking about, know what they're looking for when they're looking at the papers that fall into those particular spaces. But that skills matrix becomes fairly self-defining. And what it doesn't allow for, I think, is the other points that you were making about issues around gender, issues about diverse voices from different cultures, issues around new ways of thinking that might perhaps be generational, if you like. So I wonder, when you're looking at board makeups, is that something that you take into account as well when you're advising boards on potentially where there might be some areas that they could develop and enhance?
Oh, sure. Look, Michael, and my advising too is direct and indirect as well. And so, but when I'm advising other people who may be advising boards as well, if it's quite indirect, it certainly is. And it comes down to what I say is look a bit further. And again, it comes down to, and I can't say it enough, is that alignment of where the organisation's going. Are they getting the right people to help it steer that way? So definitely. And getting that message across, though, can be a little bit hard. And so not so much changing, but people are seeing that the value for going in different directions is certainly there, but I have to, and other people have to sell in that value, say the why and what they can get out of it. If we don't, then it kind of just falls back to that default of asking for the same kind of people, which is okay, but they could do so much better if they did something else.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, because there are aspects of a monoculture that can be beneficial. You get a kind of consistency of culture, you get a continuity of culture, if you like, but also that potentially can lead to, I guess, a stagnation of ideas, whereas potentially having a sort of plurality of cultures on a board level will inevitably, bring potentially conflict to bear. But conflict isn't necessarily always a bad thing when you're discussing ideas and you're looking at how the strategic plan that an organization might have in place can be sort of best effected. So when we're looking at bringing people onto a board, how do you see that rolling out? How is it potentially risky, or is, how would you see it being most effectively implemented?
I think the first thing is, what kind of board do we want first? And that goes on analysing what gaps have we got. Again, where are we going with the organisation, and who do we want on that board to help fill that, especially those skill sets. And coming back, and I think the most sometimes confronting and a little bit difficult for most boards or groups of people is being challenged, but that's always when you are challenged and someone does say something that not necessarily everyone agrees with, it can be really positive and certainly bring up a lot more questions or a lot more opportunities, say, for a board. And I remember some time ago with my studies, and I saw close up a board who practiced it. Some years ago, they had a son of a bee on a board, so we called it the SOB. And so that was someone coming onto the board, or whatever group it might be, and they would purposely challenge decisions. They would purposely challenge the why and why things are getting done. And what that did, and not so much of a confrontational kind of expected, intentional, is just making sure that people have had a good think, that they're looking at decisions, why they were made, that we're breaking down any possible negative groupthink that might be in that room, and we're already making the best decision at the end of the day. And that goes a heck of a long way to do that. And then I think also understanding when we have people coming onto those boards, exactly what the roles are, what different, as you said before, skill sets they can provide, and then to get the best out of those board members by asking them the right questions from their varied experience, and let them talk, encourage them to talk, and encourage them to bring those experiences to the table. Some won't. Some may feel that if they say something, it might be silly, or it might not be on point, or it might not be as expertise as somebody else, but they need to be encouraged in that boardroom to make sure that it's open. Nothing's a silly question or a silly answer, and that everything is considered. And I think it's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, that point you're making there about having people on the board who are willing to challenge the status quo, willing to challenge decisions and dig a little deeper rather than simply follow the group and agree with the decisions that are being made without necessarily engaging with the rationale behind those decisions, is really, really important. But that then, I think, moves us on to the next point, which is it's very difficult for someone when they're on a board to construct a meaningful question without them having a sense of what they're looking at, what they're questioning. Now, obviously, if you've got a risk specialist on board, they'll look at areas of where there are significant risks entailed. Likewise, if you've got someone with a legal background, they'll be able to specialize in those particular areas. But more generally speaking, education seems to be a key piece in ensuring that you've got potentially a board not uniquely made up of specialists in their area, but also people who are alive more generally to the areas that are relevant to the board but might fall outside their areas of expertise. So in terms of how you go about ensuring that you've got a board that has sufficient specialists to drive the organization forward, but who are also able to be alive to other areas that might fall outside their initial remit, how, in your experience, have boards gone about doing that?
Yeah, Michael, look, if the question is around, it's a very good question, just so I've got it straight, is around making sure that everyone can contribute their best they can by understanding as much as they can about
Exactly.
not
Yep.
just board, but the organisation. Yes, yes. And what I have heard and I've seen is that boards are now making sure that when people are coming on, that they, through their hopefully rigorous kind of selection process as much as possible, understand the person as much as possible, understand if there could be just some light gaps or some more areas that could help that person when they get there. And to do this, implementing things like short workshops for, say, risk management and making sure that's aligned with the way the organisation does risk management, also going further and looking at the future scope of the organisation and its environment, going through things like balance sheets just to make sure. The board members sometimes may get on there and still not quite au fait or expertise, as we wouldn't expect all of them to be, in, say, finances or accounting, but making sure they can understand those balance sheets enough to ask, to challenge, and also maybe even have a suggestion on at the same time, but certainly understand where it's going. And then making sure they're all on the same page around that training, that everyone is getting consistent on the same level and everyone, again, is aligned to the board and the organisation. I think that's really important. But you can see from what I'm explaining here is that people are really starting to think, what can we do better? How can we do it? And what we should be doing. And again, also what they're doing is bringing it down to shorter chunks of any kind of upskilling, any kind of awareness or things like that. So one, they capture their interest, but also they keep it very relevant. So I think that is coming more and more into that culture.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, because particularly larger organizations, there is a key aspect, the learning and development team, who drive training and education pieces within the organizational structure. But it's not very often you see L&D pointing back up to the board and building short courses or building education pieces for them. That tends, in my experience at least, to be sort of left to the directors themselves to go off and pursue. But clearly that's a key piece that perhaps organizations need to explore a little bit further.
Yes, yes, I agree. And I don't think there's any end to exploring. And because of the environment's change, organisations change quite rapidly now, keeping up with whatever they might be doing. It has to keep that momentum up and has to keep on point. And that's when we need to go back, again, in the risk management kind of way, to make sure that something isn't lapsing, we aren't assuming anything, and we are keeping on top of it, and we are keeping aligned. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, because quite often, without the benefit of that education, some directors, either innocently or otherwise, might find themselves in a position where they do inadvertently breach their duties, and not through any sort of malice or ill will, but just find themselves caught in a position where, for example, and I can think of an obvious one, although in this particular case there were some other issues in play, where a gentleman was the director of two companies where there was a reverse takeover involved. And he found himself, and the courts found subsequently, that he wasn't able to fulfill his duties to act in the best interests of one company and the other company simultaneously. By acting in one direction for one company, it was going to, the first company would suffer some serious prejudicial results as a result of his activities, and vice versa. And I think being alive to those notions, in the absence of legal training, there's an element there that the organisation might have a responsibility, perhaps, to ensure that its directors are alive to all of the aspects of the obligations that they have as a director, and not put themselves in a position where they are in default of their duties by trying to balance the demands of two separate legal entities.
Yes, and look, coming back to again to that one symbol, but there's probably a lot more in there, taking the care, diligence and skill as a reasonable director, if you like. I think it's on both. I think it's on the board as well as the director to make sure they have enough information at hand, to make sure they are keeping up to date on legislation policies, especially ones that are really relevant to the organisation and the environment around them, even things like ESG or whatever it might be. And also getting that advice from places like, if you're in New Zealand, like the IOD or Governance New Zealand or whoever it may be, and making sure that you're up to scratch as much as possible to avoid any chance of those kind of liabilities or problems on your role, and especially things with that are coming up to be more prevalent, like well-being, workplace health and safety, things like that. They might sound a little bit in the weeds to some directors and things like that, but they can have a major impact to an organisation. So understanding the fundamentals of those and the legalities they hold at the same time and how you can be accountable is really important. So I think it's on both, but I think it's something that can't be assumed and it needs to be kept up with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that quite often there is an assumption there that in the absence of any obvious issues, everything's fine. Everyone knows what they need to know. Everyone's educating themselves about what the law looks like today and what potential legislative changes will roll out tomorrow and how that will affect boards. But I think that's an assumption that can't always be made. I mean, I'm sure that when people are on boards, they do take their responsibility seriously, but inevitably, people have busy lives. Making sure that they're on top of potential vicarious liability that they may face as a director in the event of an accident in the work health and safety space, for example. That's something that they genuinely need to be on top of. But it's a question about, as you said, it's getting everyone involved in that education piece and not just trusting that people are taking it on themselves to make sure that they're across what their obligations are.
It is, Michael, and we're just jumping on that as well, and something that I saw some years ago that was practiced, which is really good, and through my various studies as well, I see that other boards in different countries are doing it, is that it was called kind of, one term was stepping down from the pedestal, and that was board members going through the organisation, learning more about it, meeting some of the people, seeing exactly how some things are done, especially key areas that might affect them in any kind of impact way, whether it be reputational risk or otherwise, and really getting a feel for it. And the people who have done that, being board members and going back and sitting at that table, had a very different view of the organisation, had different thinking about risk, had different thinking certainly about accountabilities and different areas where they could really focus efforts. But overall, they had a better understanding, and that is the absolute key, Michael, is understanding the organisation has so many positives, but there's some members who still don't fully do that or know how to do that.
Yeah, and look, I think that's certainly right. It's when, and I think possibly that's become more prevalent over the course of the past couple of years. It's traditionally boards have all met together in a room, so not always necessarily on site on the shop floor, if you like, but certainly sort of get together face to face. But these days, with the advent of a more, I guess, remote working environment, the chances of board members actually stepping into an organization and seeing how it functions at first hand becomes just that little bit more difficult. But obviously, that's still a key piece in the puzzle, because ultimately, the board is there directing the organization, and without a thorough understanding of what that organization is and what the culture looks like and how it works on the ground, it's very, very hard to marry up some of the points that you might have identified as being key in the strategic plan to how those will be implemented within the organization itself.
Look, I agree, Michael. Exactly, and it comes down to what I've seen as the little things, and too many things can be assumed as that's the way it's done, or that's how it was done in the past, or it will be fine. And if we don't look at those enough, and again, not to get too in the weeds with boards, but if we don't look at those things enough and we start assuming too much, then they can add up to being quite a risk that turns into something more. So it is having good understanding. If you don't understand, then go and get people who can let you know what's going on, or articulate it, or go and get advice about the organisation or something like that. But you certainly need to have that, the finger on the pulse.
Yeah, because without that kind of genuine sense and genuine understanding of the organisation, you can't properly understand some of the risks that an organisation might face. Which I guess leads on to the next point. When boards are looking at the risks that the organisation that they're part of might face, obviously there's you'll hopefully have a risk and compliance subcommittee that's bringing the board's attention to these particular areas. But I know that one of the things that you were talking about that lent towards a more proactive understanding of risk was scenario training. Could you expand on that just a little bit more?
Oh, Michael, I'm a big fan of scenario training, especially from my background. I think it does a lot. Look, scenario training needs to come in more. Some organisations are practicing this. I saw it a few months ago with an organisation where, for example, they were talking about risk. So they're split into two teams on the board, and one team went off and looked at all the positive things about the organisation and all the good things about it and where it's going. And the other team went off and they looked at all the risks and potential issues and what could go wrong and what they thought. And then they come back together and had a bit of a sharing and a bit of a debate about that. Now, what came out of that was some really positive stuff about what could be lurking in the background being risk or issue that the board wasn't necessarily aware of, that now they started talking about it where they wouldn't have talked about it before. What they thought was really going well, that probably needed some work or it wasn't going so well, and certainly uncovered some gaps where adding to the risk register, there's a few more items to add in there that hadn't been thought of before that they should write down. And this then pointed at other areas they should do more scenario training in specific tasks or specific areas of the organisation. So that worked really well. So, but again, this comes back to sometimes the uncomfortable thing of challenging ourselves. The board looking in the mirror and going, where are we really and how are we really travelling? Can we find any problems or issues here? And I think that's really good. When they did that also, they then started forecasting from what they'd learned from that exercise and saying, well, what does it look like in the future? This is where we are now and this is what we've just found. So you can really make sure a lot better that you are on point with your alignment and your strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that ties into another piece that people are getting more and more involved in at the moment, which is the concept of operational resilience. And I think that in order to, and certainly in Australia, we're seeing at the moment that there's been certainly APRA with the drive towards a prudential standard that addresses operational risk and resilience, looking at sort of pulling out a CPS 231 and 232 and bundling those into a new CPS 230, getting organizations to have a thorough understanding of not just the risks that the organizations face internally, but also the risks that an organization faces because it is inevitably part of a broader ecosystem. And I think that this kind of scenario training lends itself to a better understanding of what operational resilience might mean for an organization, because you can't deal to a risk until you've identified that risk, of course.
Very much. And look, what I also been seeing in my consulting days up to recently is that we have two streams here. One stream where a board organisation may have pretty much think they've sussed their risk management, their resilience, they have the templates and procedures to guide them, and should something go wrong, they have their risk management matrix and their everything else around that, and they're happy with that. But then something happens and they have to make sure that whatever happened actually fits in to those things I just mentioned. And if it doesn't, then they have to do something ad hoc or kind of far to the left that they didn't think of before. So it's a bit of a game of chance, but they're very, very well prepared, it looks like on the outset. The other stream is that you have that preparedness, but you're also saying, what else could happen? What else do we need to do? Have we looked hard enough? And then going back to, say, that scenario training as well of challenging oneself on that board and organisation and saying, are we resilient enough? Back to your point, I don't think we ever are. I mean, we can't be 100% resilient, but we can certainly do what we can. But we almost must accept the fact that because we're not 100% resilient, we need some work if something does happen. And that comes back to then understanding implicitly your environment, where you're going, everyone around you, from competitors to the people you work with to partners, all that kind of thing comes into that risk and really that resilience plan. And that's where it's kind of never ending, but we must do the best we can. Going back to that first stream, if we sit there and we're happy with what we've done and we said we're prepared, that's when I have red flags going up going, are we really? Are you really? And that's when we have to go to the other stream again going, let's do some more thinking. So putting that into a nutshell, not confusing the matter, what I'm really saying is that we have to keep thinking, we have to keep challenging, and we have to keep that momentum up of seeing what could be over the next rise.
Yeah, and that notion of constant vigilance is the watchword. You've really got to, if I think that point, you're right. You make is absolutely right. If you sit back and go, everything's fine, we've got everything covered, then perhaps at that moment in time, you were right. But with the passage of time, things drift, things change, new things arise, and all of a sudden, where you might have been comfortable at one point, you're potentially seriously uncomfortable at the next. So when we're talking, and ultimately, I think today's discussion is broadly speaking about how to make a board better. And in general terms, I think we've covered off some of the key points there. But ultimately, and I think there's an element of this caught within the new models that we're seeing arising out of the push towards ESG frameworks, where people are looking at measuring and reporting on data that talks to an organization's social impact, an organization's governance impact, an organization's environmental impact. How do you go about identifying useful measurable metrics to track a board's improvement over time?
Oh, look, another good question, Michael. And from what I know, it's really, again, when you understand the organisation, you understand alignment, then you'll know what kind of metrics or what kind of consultancy advice you need for that. If you don't, then you get that consultancy advice in, you work with them very closely, and together you learn exactly what you may need and where you may need it. Then only then will you know kind of what measures and metrics that you need to have in place to really make sure you're accurately getting that information that you do need, because if you don't and it's inaccurate, it can really put your organisation off course. And a couple of degrees, as you know, 2 years later is a lot of degrees in the end. So it's also easy to say, get a system, get some advice or whatever to do those metrics, to get those measures, but you really need that, a lot of information, a lot of data to make sure you get that right in the first place before you embark on that or before you commit to it.
Yeah, I think that that's a really key point, because ultimately what you want is a more effective board. But if you don't know the baseline level of effectiveness today, so that you can begin to understand areas that you can improve on and then track those areas of improvement, then really all you're doing is kind of drifting with the tide, so to speak, rather than taking an active role to build a better board, a stronger board that ultimately results in a better and stronger organization.
Yes, and also when you've got those measures in place or the metrics you want to be using, then we've got something else we have to concentrate on, which I'm sure you've seen yourself, and that when we are measuring, we're getting reports back, this is where it can all fall down again. So we need to know what we're looking for and what makes that measure successful, what we deem is actually okay to move on, and what we're happy to tolerate or what is acceptable. And say, for example, if we're asking for a measure from someone or something and it comes back and it says this has been done and we've met that KPI measure, whatever it might be, a metric, we need to know, well, how did we meet it? Is there anything missing from that? Gives us some more information about what it means to meet that, and have we found anything along the way instead of just a tick in the box. So we have to be very challenging as well about looking at those metrics and how we do that.
Yeah, and importantly, revisit those metrics, because again, once you've ticked off the box in the KPI that says we've achieved what we needed to at this point, then again, the point needs to be made that you can't just leave that be. You then need to revisit that on a cadence that's appropriate to the risks associated with it, perhaps, and then make sure that, again, what was fit for purpose a year ago or 2 years ago is still fit for purpose now. And whether regulations change, whether legislation's changed, whether the organization has changed. Because, particularly at the moment, you see that there are some significant global shocks occurring out there, and that may necessarily cause organizations to revisit aspects of their operations that will of necessity warrant internal reviews to make sure that the structures that were in place when the organization did A, B, and C are still relevant for when the organization now does B, C, and D.
It is, and you can completely articulate it very well, Michael. And look, just one thing to add to that, we still have, it's not so much a culture, but probably a practice in some organisations where, for example, I'll go in and they'll say, what is the main risk? And I might even say, well, I think it's the risk management team. And they'll say, why is that? And I say, well, with all good intention, they're doing completely the right thing. Maybe we're not looking enough left or enough right. Maybe a little bit channeled in our view of what we think's right, of what we think we're measuring, and the measure for actually ticking that off. And we're not challenging ourselves or themselves enough, or asking the right questions in the different areas, or getting someone impartial to come in and have a look at what they're doing and ask questions and challenge that. So that's something else just to think about at the same time, that never think everything is completely perfect or we're going the right way. Always have another look at it.
Yeah, and that gets back to the point you were making before about having someone on the board who's willing to challenge decisions, who's willing to ask why. Now, why are we doing this? Why are we diverting assets and resources into this particular project? And what are the opportunity costs if we go down this path? What else in the organization will suffer as a result of assets being diverted away from that? And I guess,
sorry, Michael. Yes, and just on that point, that then comes back to from the get-go of making sure we've got the right people on. Now they need to be aligned more, and that's upskilling. It might be some workshopping or whatever, making sure they can do this, they can do that, and they can read and they can challenge. So you can see how all of a sudden it's gone in one big circle of getting the right people to actually ask those questions in the first place to go forward.
yeah. And so I guess finally, I mean, given we've obviously sort of canvassed a lot of different areas today, what sort of resources can people look to help them maybe take some action on some of the points that we have discussed today?
I think the resources, and going back again to look, the key ones being the Companies Act, working with organisations, as I said, in New Zealand, ID, Governance New Zealand, things like that. But resources also, I think, come down to a lot of areas that, say, our members are asking for, and people I know they're asking for. They're going into things like case studies. They're going into real live events of actually what happened to organisations, how it happened, what they did about it, what was the lessons learned. And that's becoming so more popular now in our industry and other industries, is what actually happened to other people and how can we learn from that. And I think this is one of the biggest, most important resources kind of coming to the surface, and realistic resources. It's great having guidance, it's great having things to follow, and that's very, very important. But one thing people are missing is actually, okay, we've got all that, what we should do, but what happens when that goes wrong? And that teaches them so much more. So resources, really, it's as creative as you want to be, I think, but it's actually looking in the places that are going to help you, asking the right questions, but getting, again, a very diverse range of material to look at and really learn yourself. And there's nothing better also than going to people who've been there, done that, and saying, what happened? How did you do it? That's a great source. And I think we've really got to start thinking broadly in those areas.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. So I guess in summary, there's 4 key areas that we looked at today in terms of making boards better, if you like. I guess the first aspect is to get a genuine understanding of the organization of which you're a director, and then ensuring that there is a culture of questioning that the organization genuinely encourages in order to, I guess, canvass all of the issues that might be in play. Developing a metric that you're comfortable with that will allow you to determine where an organization's, or the board's rather, weaknesses and strengths are, and be able to track their growth and development over time. And I guess the final point was, and this is something we've talked about before, we were talking about the issue of leadership. And I don't know that we've addressed it, as fully as we could, but I'd like to finish on that point, if we could, about where you see what properly effective leadership looks like when it comes to the board.
Yeah, and look, I agree with the other 3 points, and fourth is very important to me. I see leadership myself. For example, I see leadership myself as really guiding organizations, guiding risk management, guiding kind of everything. And I know the word leadership in itself is kind of in question today of what does it actually mean. But looking at boards, for example, leadership to me means what I've seen of just, as we've talked about today, making sure people understand the organisation, encouraging their input. Simple things like chairing the meetings so we get the best effective use of that time, because you'll see many meetings kind of go off, things aren't talked about, or they kind of rush, so decisions aren't made as they should be. The agenda items are precise. They've been thought about. It's really going to make a difference if we talk about it, but also what do we want to get out of those agenda items? What is the objective and what are the measures for that? Do we have something like that in place to make sure that absolutely every meeting has the maximum amount of value coming out of it. And then looking for solutions in that meeting as well, even if it's just the initial ones or some ideas or discussions. What can we get out of that to actually come to some solutions? So I think leadership is key here. And if anything at all, it's making sure that things are simply done to time. It is encouraging everyone there to take part. It's chairing it in a way that you're sharing it around. And also with that leadership, a good thing I see sometimes is that they share that leadership around. They share the chairing of the meeting. They share responsibility, so everyone can kind of get in there, have a go, learn it. Doesn't matter what kind of level that board may be, and everyone becomes more basically as that team or more on track. So I think leadership is key here, as you said, and it's probably got some improvement to go, but simple improvement. It's just really getting everybody involved and having a better level of understanding.
Yeah, and I think but that's key, because ultimately, the drive to build a better board will often rest on the shoulders of the chair, and in certain instances, what that might inevitably mean is an acknowledgement that there's room for growth, there's room for improvement. Even the chair may have weaknesses that they want to overcome and build out and turn into strengths, and also the notion that leadership doesn't necessarily fall on one person's shoulders, is that you can begin to develop a leadership group within a board where you can begin to devolve responsibility, but also grant people authority, so that you do not just have a diversity of voices, but there are opportunities for that diversity of voices to be heard and acknowledged and paid proper respect. So I do take the point that leadership is a many and varied thing, but ultimately it's key to what the success of the board looks like.
Oh, no, exactly right. And look, we've had some, and we do have some great chairs, and that's been brilliant for us. It certainly makes a huge difference in our organisation. It takes us a long, long way, and it does come down to that the key thing through risk management, through business, through everything that is really rising to the surface is how people get along, how you understand your team, how you understand people, everything from empathy to well-being. All of that really goes into that leadership, and it really transforms into performance. So nothing's wasted at all. So I think we're learning a lot, but we've got a way to go. And I'll always say it's all about people.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, David, that brings us to time today. Thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and your insight into this matter. I'm sure everyone who's been listening to this podcast has got something from it, at least. We do, I believe, have another podcast coming up early next year, covering off issues about some of the inherent risks that boards are facing. But look, in the meantime, I'll say thank you again for your time and your wisdom, and look forward to doing this after what I hope is a restful and peaceful summer holidays.
Thank you very much, Michael. Always loved being here. Really enjoyed it. I speak from my experience, and look, I've met a few people now and a few organisations, so it's really interesting what I do find. I'm looking forward to the risks that we talk about next year, and really looking at that field. That'll be fantastic. And you too. You have a great Christmas and a great break, and I'll catch up with you then.
Brilliant. Look forward to it very much. Thank you.
Thank you.